Number 1, Brenda Ann Spencer. When she was just 16, Brenda Ann Spencer lived a quiet life in suburban San Diego, mostly invisible and unremarkable. Her father worked odd jobs while her mother had long since left. Brenda shared a single mattress on the living room floor with her father in a house strewn with empties. She was a poor student, often seen drifting through classes at Patrick Henry High. Neighbors remembered her as thin, red-haired, socially distant and quiet, but with a simmering hostility toward authority, especially toward police officers. In the year before the shootings, Brenda's behavior escalated. A probation officer arranged a psychiatric evaluation, which recommended hospitalization for depression. Her father refused. Later, he gave her a .22 caliber rifle and hundreds of rounds of ammunition for Christmas, even though she had asked for a radio. Brenda once said, "I asked for a radio and got a rifle," reflecting that her father needed a rifle, so I would kill myself. That same year, she had broken into the elementary school across the street while on probation for vandalism. It was Monday morning, January 29th, 1979. Brenda, seated in the front room of her house across from Grover Cleveland Elementary School, opened fire at 7:51 a.m. She picked off people one by one, targeting the principal Burton Ragg and a custodian named Mike Sucher as staff members helped children enter the school. 8 students and 1 responding police officer were wounded. A garbage truck was pushed in front of the entrance, halting further carnage. Brenda fired 36 times from her house, then barricaded herself inside, speaking for hours over the phone with a reporter. When asked why, she calmly said, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." Authorities quickly traced the shots to Brenda's home. Surrendering only after being promised a Burger King meal, she was arrested and charged as an adult. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon. On April 4th, 1981 day, after her 18th birthday, she received concurrent sentences of 25 years to life in prison. 9 counts of attempted murder were dropped. The media labeled her America's first modern school shooter, and public outrage came fast. Survivors and families of the deceased demanded life without parole. At her first parole hearing in 1993, Brenda said she had hoped police would shoot her and admitted drug and alcohol use, though tests had shown none. In subsequent hearings, she claimed hallucinations, trauma from her father, and epilepsy, but the parole board consistently found her unreformed and a continuing risk. She was denied release in 1993, 2001, 2005, 2009, 2022, and again, most recently in February 2025. She remains imprisoned at the California Institution for Women in Chino and will next be eligible for parole in 2028. Prosecutors emphasized the depth of harm survivor trauma and the fear that her release would reopen wounds for the families involved. Psychologists and Brenda herself have cited a volatile mix of personal trauma, mental illness, and growing alienation. Interviewed decades later, she admitted feeling isolated, depressed, and angry at authorities, saying police were pigs. She described how even small childhood injuries and undiagnosed brain injury from a bicycle fall may have contributed to cognitive and emotional disturbance. Experts saw a convergence untreated depression substance, use, social rejection, and a lethal gift of a weapon. Today, her story asks a haunting question: how does a disengaged, troubled teenager become the trigger point for national tragedy? Brenda Ann Spencer's name remains inseparable from "I don't like Mondays," not only as the chilling quote she gave, but as a statement about a broader failure to perceive warning signs, to offer help, and to protect the vulnerable before violence erupts. Number 2, Karen Ann Severson and Laura Ann Doyle. Karen Ann Severson and Laura Ann Doyle were both 17 years old when their names became forever tied to one of the most shocking murders to come out of California's San Fernando Valley in the mid-1980s. Both girls were high school juniors at San Fernando High, raised in working-class families, with no criminal history and no outward signs of the darkness that would later unfold. From childhood, they had been inseparable from Michelle Missiavilla, a lively and popular teenager, admired for her looks and friendly nature. To the outside world, these were three ordinary girls navigating the highs and lows of teenage life, football games, school dances, and crushes that came and went. But underneath the surface, cracks began to form. When Michelle started dating a boy named Randy, Karen felt pushed aside. After Michelle broke things off, Karen began dating him herself, igniting jealousy and a storm of rumors. Laura, quieter but simmering with her own resentments, felt overshadowed by Michelle's popularity and beauty. Over time, the tension escalated. Friends recalled angry confrontations in school hallways, whispered accusations about betrayal, and even threats that, at the time, no one believed would lead to real harm. On the first day of October 1985, Michelle agreed to spend time with Karen and Laura. They drove her to Angeles National Forest, a secluded area where the trio often hung out. What began as a conversation turned into a heated argument. The two girls accused Michelle of spreading rumors and stealing boyfriends. Tempers flared, and somewhere amid the shouting and shoving, the confrontation crossed an unthinkable line. Michelle was forced into a shallow creek. Witnesses later testified that Laura cut off part of Michelle's hair in rage while Karen held her down. Without explicit violence described, the simple act of betrayal was devastating. Two former friends turning on the third. A few days later, hikers discovered Michelle's body in the creek, pinned under a heavy log. Her death shocked the tight-knit community. Police opened an investigation, but despite interviews and rumors, no arrests were made. For nearly 3 years, the case remained unsolved. During that time, Karen and Laura stayed close to Michelle's grieving family, attending the funeral, offering comfort, and even moving in with her mother for a while. Their public displays of grief masked a chilling truth. The breakthrough came in July 1988 when a mutual friend, racked with guilt, came forward to police. The witness revealed details only the killers could have known, placing Karen and Laura at the scene of the crime. Investigators arrested both women, piecing together a story of jealousy, betrayal, and emotional volatility. The fact that they had mourned alongside Michelle's family made the revelation even more heartbreaking for those who loved her. In March 1990, both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were convicted of second-degree murder. The jury determined that while the crime was intentional, it lacked the premeditation necessary for a first-degree conviction. Each girl received a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. Karen served more than 20 years before her release in December 2011. Laura remained behind bars for nearly 22 years, gaining parole in July 2020. Even after their release, controversy followed. Karen gave interviews expressing remorse and began speaking publicly about bullying and toxic friendships, yet she faced backlash when she attempted to publish a memoir about the crime. Public outrage over the idea of killers profiting from their stories helped inspire Missy's Law in California, ensuring families of victims have a say before convicts can benefit financially from their crimes. Laura, in contrast, stayed largely silent after release, avoiding the media spotlight altogether. Experts who reviewed the case suggest the motive was less about pure malice and more about overwhelming jealousy and fragile teenage identity. Both girls reportedly struggled with feelings of rejection and insecurity emotions that spiraled into a fatal act of rage. The story remains chilling because it wasn't committed by hardened criminals. It was a tragedy born inside a once trusted friendship. Decades later, Shelia Avila's murder still haunts those who remember her. It leaves behind enduring questions. How does a bond built in childhood transform into lethal resentment? And can any apology, no matter how heartfelt, ever undo the devastation left in its wake? Number 3, Ruthann Veal. When Ruthann Veal was 14 years old, she was a runaway youth in Waterloo, Iowa. With no stable home, limited schooling, and a history of placements in juvenile facilities. She had no formal occupation beyond survival on the street. In June 1993, she entered the home of Catherine Hayes, a 66-year-old woman, and violently stabbed her at least 23 times. Tried as an adult under Iowa law at the time, Veal was convicted of first-degree murder in May 1994 and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, making her one of only 2 Iowa girls ever subject to that punishment at such a young age. Ruthann grew up in extreme instability. Born into a home marked by parental alcoholism and abuse, she bounced between relatives and group homes from early childhood. By her early teens, she had multiple incidents of running away and minor offenses. Teachers and social workers described a deeply traumatized child emotionally shut down and responding to stress with defiance and escape. Psychological or situational triggers were dramatic. Lesser offenses and attempted escapes intensified her sense of entrapment. At facilities, she encountered other troubled children but never found real care. Counselors later described her as emotionally reactive with unresolved trauma and an impulsive sense of control. Experts suggested that her survival-driven mindset, layered with mounting anger and adolescent turmoil, created a volatile psychological profile. On that June night in 1993, a garnished narrative emerged. Veal left juvenile custody, walked into a stranger's house, and attacked Catherine Hayes with a kitchen knife. Authorities found Hayes with multiple stab wounds. The intensity of the assault suggested rage confusion, an emotional breakdown rather than calculated homicide. Ruthann was arrested within days, formally transferred to adult court, and indicted for first-degree murder. The investigation included homicide detectives, juvenile caseworkers, and psychologists evaluating her state of mind. At trial, defense attorneys emphasized her age, family abuse, and psychiatric background. Prosecutors focused on the brutality and the mandatory sentencing structure. The jury convicted Veal of first-degree murder. Because Iowa law mandated life without parole for such crimes by juveniles, the judge had no option but to impose that sentence. Veal became legally defined as someone with no future. For nearly 2 decades, Ruthann Veal served her mandatory life term, isolated from any opportunity for release. In January 2010, her attorneys at the Equal Justice Initiative argued before the Iowa Supreme Court that her sentence was cruel and unusual, given her age and circumstances. Though her conviction was upheld, the legal landscape began to shift around juvenile justice when the United States Supreme Court ruled in Miller versus Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. Iowa responded. In December 2013, the state resentenced Ruthann Veal to life with the possibility of parole. She remained incarcerated but could eventually return to society. Veal was paroled in 2020 at age 42 after serving nearly 27 years behind bars. Her release sparked debate. Some advocated for the possibilities of rehabilitation, while others demanded reparations to the victim's family. Ruthann reportedly pursued therapy, educational programs, and ministerial work within prison. But just 2 years later, in late 2022, she was reincarcerated for parole violations, visiting bars and casinos, repeatedly despite restrictions, ignoring curfews, and accruing fines owed for restitution. These breaches prompted a swift return to jail custody under new charges. Psychologists who reviewed Veal's case emphasized key themes: adolescent brain immaturity, trauma-induced impulsivity, and the rigidity of sentencing without individualized assessment. Ruthann's trajectory highlights how a vulnerable child, isolated and abused, can become defined by a single act rather than by her potential for recovery. Her legal journey stands as a cautionary tale about punishment without rehabilitation. The story of Ruthann Veal is more than a tragic crime. It compels a haunting question: can a justice system that once erased every chance at redemption pivot toward mercy when the person behind the name was barely a child? Number 4, Kristina Fetters. Kristina Joy Fetters was just 14 years old when she committed a crime that would upend her entire life. On October 25th, 1994, living the life of a runaway in Des Moines, she had no steady home, no occupation, and lists of unaddressed trauma. Born in February 1980 in Des Moines, she carried the scars of an unstable childhood, abuse, neglect, and early exposure to violence. and by early adolescence had cycled through juvenile facilities and runaway episodes. And before the crime, she had little agency, and peers described her as isolated, deeply wounded, and emotionally reactive. Psychological or situational triggers began long before that fateful day. By 12, she had escaped custody multiple times, dropped out of schooling, and entered a psychiatric treatment center called Orchard Place. There, she formed fantasies, including one to rob and kill her 73-year-old great aunt, whom she called Grandma Pooper. She later shared those plans with another resident, a history of unresolved trauma and poor impulse control, along with possible abuse by an older boyfriend who had kidnapped and assaulted her, pushed her judgment toward emotional extremes. On that autumn day, Fetters and a peer named Jeannie Fox escaped the facility and hitchhiked to her aunt's home. Once there, they waited until a visitor left, then entered. What followed was not the work of a mindless act, but, according to court findings, a violent and urgent attempt at robbery abruptly turned lethal. She struck her aunt with an object report sight, a frying pan, attempted to cut her throat, then stabbed her with a paring knife. After the crime, both left unreconciled, undisguised. Prior to morning's end, Fetters was arrested and quickly confessed. During legal proceedings in December 1995, now aged 15, Fetters was tried as an adult for first-degree murder. She pleaded insanity, claiming diminished understanding of her actions. Prosecutors argued the killing had been planned, as confirmed by statements from others at Orchard Place. A Polk County jury convicted her, and under Iowa law at the time, the sentence was mandatory life without parole. At just 15, she became the youngest person in Iowa's history to receive such a sentence. Her incarceration spanned nearly 2 decades under that decree. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled mandatory life without parole for juveniles unconstitutional in Miller versus Alabama. That ruling opened wounds and possibilities in Iowa. In November 2013, a Polk County judge resentenced her to life with the possibility of parole. Given her diagnosis of late-stage breast cancer, the same court recommended immediate release. In December, the Iowa Parole Board granted compassionate release to a hospice facility in Des Moines, the first juvenile offender in state history to leave under such conditions. She spent her final months receiving palliative care, surrounded by family, in a circle who had forgiven her even while many remained unforgiving. On July 27, 2014, at the age of 34, Kristina Joy Fetters succumbed to the disease. News outlets remembered her not only as a convicted killer, but as a deeply complex figure at the junction of childhood trauma, legal injustice, and human fragility. Psychologists reviewing her case pointed to brain research showing that adolescent brains continue developing into the mid-20s. They emphasized that unresolved trauma, mental health disorders, and emotional immaturity often distort moral reasoning in youth. Experts questioned whether a child, especially one struggling for survival, should ever face a sentence that erased all possibility of rehabilitation. Her journey became a stark illustration of how justice systems sometimes mistake punishment for protection. Kristina Fetters' story is not simply about one murder. It is a mirror held up to how society responds to suffering in a child's mind. She was 14, though treated as an adult, terminally ill, yet imprisoned without mercy. In the silence after her release, a lingering question remains: when a young person commits violence under the weight of trauma, what is the path to accountability that still leaves room for redemption? Number 5, Sara Kruzan. Sara Kruzan was only 16 years old when her life took a tragic and irreversible turn. Born in Riverside, California, she was raised in an environment marked by instability, abuse, and a profound lack of safety. Her childhood was fractured by neglect, and by early adolescence, she was searching for love and belonging wherever she could find it. At 13, Sara met George Howard, a man who initially posed as a caring father figure, but behind that facade, he would become her trafficker, forcing her into prostitution and robbing her of the normal teenage years she deserved. Howard's control over Sara was absolute. Through manipulation, intimidation, and emotional exploitation, he conditioned her to believe she owed him everything. Friends and teachers saw glimpses of her potential. An intelligent young girl who excelled academically, but no one fully understood the nightmare she was enduring behind closed doors. Over the next few years, Sara's emotional wounds deepened. The relentless trauma left her feeling cornered, hopeless, and desperate for a way out. In March of 1994, Sara's desperation reached its breaking point. She arranged to meet Howard at a riverside motel. The meeting under ordinary circumstances would have been another moment of control and fear, but this time was different. Carrying a handgun provided by another adult, Sara entered the motel room and shot Howard. It was a single act that ended years of abuse, but it also began her journey through the criminal justice system. Sara fled the scene but was arrested soon afterward. During questioning, she admitted to the shooting and spoke openly about the years of exploitation she endured. Yet prosecutors framed the incident as premeditated murder, focusing on the act rather than the circumstances. In 1995, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder. The sentence was severe life imprisonment without the possibility of parole plus an additional 4-year term. She was 16 years old, facing the reality of spending the rest of her life behind bars. Her story did not fade quietly. Over time, it drew national attention and sparked heated debate about juvenile sentencing and how the justice system treats victims of trafficking. Advocates, legal reformers, and human rights organizations rallied to her cause, arguing that Sara's punishment ignored the context of her abuse and her age. In 2011, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence to life with the possibility of parole. 2 years later, after serving 18 years, Sara was released, and in 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom granted her a full pardon, acknowledging both her rehabilitation and her advocacy for survivors of exploitation. Sara Kruzan's story is more than a case file. It is a haunting reflection of how trauma survival and justice can collide. It leaves us asking, when a victim fights back, where should society draw the line between accountability and mercy? Number 6, Ashley Jones. Ashley Jones was just 14 years old on August 30th, 1999, when she and her boyfriend, 16-year-old Jeremy Hart, carried out a planned attack inside her family home in Birmingham, Alabama. Living there as a high school student with her grandparents, aunt-grandmother, and 10-year-old sister Jones had long been seen as rebellious, especially once her family forbade her relationship with Hart. Jones's early life was marked by persistent trauma. Her mother, struggling with crack addiction, forcefully abandoned her as a toddler. Her father's assaults led to hospitalization, and by age 11, her stepfather began sexually abusing her. She endured gang abductions and threats to her life. By her early teens, she was depressed, attempted suicide, and described herself as powerless to escape her environment of violence and neglect. 2 days before the attack, Jones stole her grandfather's .38 caliber handgun and secretly mixed attracting accelerants. That evening, she lured Hart to the house. He entered, shot her grandfather and aunt, both of whom later died. When her grandmother and sister awakened, she and Hart struck again. Although both survived, they sustained serious injuries. Jones and Hart then set parts of the home alight before fleeing in the family car, eventually abandoning it after stealing cash and keys. Emergency responders intervened before the fire consumed more of the structure. The next morning, police apprehended Jones and Hart after spotting the stolen Cadillac parked at a nearby hotel. Physical evidence and statements placed them at the scene. During questioning, Jones stated, "We both took part," and recounted events unemotionally. At trial, her grandmother and sister both testified not only about the crime, but later said they wished she could return home one day, expressing compassion for her despite her actions. In March 2001, a jury convicted Jones on 2 counts of capital murder, 2 of attempted murder, and several additional charges. Because she was under 18 at the time of the crimes, Alabama law barred the death penalty. Instead, she received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The media coverage was polarized. Tabloids called her a calculating predator, while advocates highlighted her case as cruel and unusual punishment for a 14-year-old who had been driven by abuse and desperation. She remains the only girl in Alabama ever sentenced to death in prison at age 14. Experts have suggested that Jones's actions were less about inherent evil and more about prolonged exposure to trauma and the influence of older peers. Neuroscientific research shows that adolescents, especially victims of abuse, often lack the judgment and impulse control of adults. These findings helped shape Miller v. Alabama 2012, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled mandatory life without parole for juveniles unconstitutional, and Montgomery versus Louisiana 2016, which made that ruling retroactive to juvenile lifers nationwide. As of now, Jones is in her late 30s and incarcerated in a maximum security prison. Her case remains a stark flashpoint in debates over juvenile sentencing, rehabilitation, and redemption. Critics argue a child her age should never be barred from release. Others insist the crime's severity demanded condemnation, regardless of background. To leave viewers unsettled if a 14-year-old can be so shaped by trauma that she plans violence, what does that say about responsibility and about our justice system's capacity for mercy? Number 7, Christine Paolilla. Christine Marie Paolilla was 17 years old in the summer of 2003, living in the Houston suburb of Clear Lake City while attending high school. At that point, she had no visible criminal record, and classmates referred to her by the nickname Miss Irresistible, a title she was awarded by votes during that spring amid an outer transformation fueled by 2 popular older classmates. Her father had died in a construction accident when she was 2, and her mother later struggled with drug addiction, resulting in custody shifts and a strongly disrupted childhood. In kindergarten, she was diagnosed with alopecia, losing her eyelashes, eyebrows, and scalp hair, and took to wearing wigs and thick glasses. Peers bullied her mercilessly. By 2003, Diane, known for her earlier struggles, had began using prescription medications and illicit substances, and had entered a romantic relationship with a 21-year-old man named Christopher Lee Snyder. Multiple friends and family members later described that relationship as isolating, emotionally abusive, and marked by jealousy. She grew jealous when he spoke to other women. He resisted her pleas to end connections with her friends. Eventually, their shared drug use overshadowed her new popularity. On the afternoon of July 18th, 2003, Paolilla and Snyder drove to a friend's home at Clear Lake City to purchase drugs. Inside were 2 of her high school friends, Tiffany Rowell and Rachel Colarudis, along with Tiffany's boyfriend, Marcus Purcella, and his cousin, Adelbert Sanchez. According to later testimony, both Paolilla and Snyder intended to steal drugs and cash, but the situation escalated during an argument between Snyder and Purcella. The conflict quickly turned violent. Both men opened fire, and in the chaos, the 4 victims were struck by bullets in quick succession. Witnesses would testify later about Colarudis attempting to crawl toward a phone before dying. Investigators said minimum 2 guns were used, likely a semi-automatic 9mm and a .38 caliber revolver. Paolilla returned to the scene and used the butt of the gun to strike Colarudis a second time, according to court records. She and Snyder fled the house, and within an hour, she reported to her job at a retail store hours before anyone knew what had happened. News of the 4 deaths rocked the community. Police interviewed dozens of students and circulated composite sketches for months, but the case remained stuck. It took an anonymous tip on July 8, 2006, more than 3 years after the murders, for investigators to finally zero in on Paolilla. The caller described details only one of the perpetrators could know. She was arrested in San Antonio on July 19, 2006, without incident, and Snyder was later found dead in a wooded area in South Carolina, ruled to be a suicide by prescription drug overdose. At trial in October 2008, Paolilla was convicted on 4 counts of capital murder. Because she was under 18 at the time of the killings, Texas law prevented the death penalty. She received a life sentence with a mandatory minimum of 40 years. All appeals failed, including a challenge to her bond amount of $500,000. She is currently incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, and is eligible for parole on July 22, 2046, when she will be 60 years old. Psychologists and defense experts emphasized how Paolilla's long-term insecurity, drug dependency, and emotional attachment to Snyder likely warped her perception of loyalty and betrayal. They argued the murders grew out of a toxic mix of adolescent fixation, substance-induced delusion, and a desperate impulse to please someone she feared losing. Prosecution countered that the crime showed clear planning, cold disregard for her friends, and calculated execution. The emotional weight of the case lies in the betrayal. Two young women who had helped her fit in ended up among the dead. As of this date, Paolilla remains incarcerated in her late 30s and debated in media and court forums as both victim and villain. She began life as a shy outsider, yet ended as the orchestrator of a tragedy that destroyed 4 futures. Ultimately, the question lingers, how does a girl transform into the architect of her closest friends' deaths, and what role did trauma, loyalty, and lethal jealousy play in her fall from grace? Number 8. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Denise Brown was only 16 years old on the night of August 6, 2004, when she found herself in the home of a man nearly triple her age who had met her in a fast food parking lot in Nashville, Tennessee. At that time, she had no steady occupation and was living as a runaway. Raised initially in foster care, she had endured childhood instability after being surrendered by her biological mother due to addiction and possible alcohol exposure in utero. She spent several years in juvenile facilities before escaping to life on the streets and eventually falling into the control of a man known as Cutthroat, whom she described as her pimp and abuser. She had never been seen as a troublemaker in school, but at 16, she was forced into a cruel survival existence that few in her earlier life could fathom. That life on the margins was marked by escalating trauma. Brown later testified that she was repeatedly assaulted, threatened with violence, and compelled into prostitution by cutthroat events that left her deeply afraid and emotionally unstable well before her fateful encounter with Johnny Allen. Friends and psychologists later described signs of emotional fragmentation and desperation. She often felt invisible and trapped outside any protective system. On that August evening, Brown met 43-year-old Johnny Michael Allen at a Sonic drive-in parking lot. Prosecutors say he offered her money for sex, and Brown claimed she feared for her life once she accepted. According to her account, at some point during the night, Allen reached toward something, and she believed it might be a gun. She says that, in terror, she used her own small firearm to shoot him. Investigators argued the victim had been asleep when shot and that Brown killed him to rob his wallet, which she later did, taking $172 and firearms from his home. The fatal shot struck him in the back of the head while he lay in a sleeping position. Brown did not deny firing, but she insisted it was self-defense. Prosecutors portrayed her actions as cold and calculated, not the product of panic. Jailhouse witnesses later testified she had jokingly discussed the killing, including an admission on tape, "I executed him," she allegedly said. Once arrested, she was indicted for first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, weapons possession, and criminal impersonation. Although barely 16, she was tried as an adult. The trial concluded in 2006 with a guilty verdict on each count. The jury rejected her self-defense claim and sentenced her to life imprisonment. Under Tennessee law, she faced a mandatory minimum of 51 years before eligibility for parole. In practical terms, she would not have been free until her late 60s. From behind prison walls, Brown worked diligently to rebuild her life. She earned her general educational diploma, an associate degree with a perfect grade point average, and later a bachelor's degree, all while exhibiting exemplary behavior. Her case caught the national spotlight when noted celebrities, including Rihanna and Kim Kardashian West, used social media campaigns to demand clemency. They argued that no surviving victim had sounded alarm, and Brown herself was a victim of child trafficking. Tennessee's 6-member clemency board was divided, but renewed public pressure moved the outgoing Governor Bill Haslam to act. On January 7, 2019, Governor Haslam commuted her sentence to 15 years, followed by 10 years of parole supervision. She was released from prison on August 7, 2019, at 31 years old. She now goes by Cyntoia Brown Long, married to a musician and advocates for victims of sex trafficking and harsh juvenile sentencing. She authored and published her memoir, Free Cyntoia, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, and has spoken at national forums advocating clemency reform for other incarcerated juveniles. She also co-founded a nonprofit supporting survivors of abuse and exploitation. Psychologists who reviewed her story noted the tension between system failures and individual responsibility. They argue that Brown was driven by trauma and fear rather than malice. Her decision to use lethal force came after prolonged manipulation by an adult prayer. Critics of her clemency emphasized the conviction and the absence of any surviving testimony from Allen, affirming their belief that justice was served. But her advocates maintain that she was a victim of systemic abuse, whose only hope lay in surviving a cruel trajectory that began long before that hotel room encounter. Now, as an adult outside the bars, she reflects that redemption and second chances should not be rewards only for the worthy, but for all who earn them through growth and healing. A question lingers when trauma bends a girl to breaking. How does she reclaim her dignity, and how long must society wait before it sees her humanity? Number 9, Erin Caffey. Erin Denise Caffey was 16 years old on the night of March 1st, 2008. She was a part-time fast food worker at a Sonic restaurant in Alba, East Texas, a devout Christian community where her family attended the Miracle Faith Baptist Church. Her father, Terry Caffey, served as a youth pastor, and Erin sang in the choir and was often described by neighbors as shy, obedient, and Bible-based in her upbringing. By early 2008, Erin was caught in a troubling romance with 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson. The relationship moved quickly. He gave her a family heirloom promise ring and openly talked about marrying her. But her parents disapproved after discovering his MySpace pages, which she'd shown them, and saw him ignoring academic expectations and distancing her from her childhood friends. Over the weeks that followed, Erin almost casually mentioned to friends that the only way she could stay with Charlie was if her parents were out of the picture. That shift talking about family murder as an escape hinted at something much darker. Her peers later said she joked about violence, but investigators later interpreted those remarks as boundary crossing, fueled by a sense of desperation. In the early pre-dawn hours of March 1st, 2008, Charlie Wilkinson and his friend Charles Wade broke into the Caffey home while Erin and another friend waited in a car outside. Wilkinson entered the bedroom of Erin's parents and shot both her mother Penny and her father Terry while they slept. When the gun jammed, Wade used a large blade. Pages later noted that Erin waited silently in the vehicle, later saying, "Just do what you got to do," when Wilkinson warned of having to kill her younger brothers to eliminate witnesses. Upstairs, Wilkinson and Wade killed Erin's brothers, Matthew, age 13, and Tyler, age 8, using the firearm on one and the sword on the other. Afterward, they torched furniture and fled with valuables. Their father, despite being shot 5 times, crawled out of the burning house and reached help after nearly 1 hour of agony. He later crawl-walked across what police said was 4 football fields to reach a neighbor's house, then identified Wilkinson to deputies. Within 24 hours, law enforcement arrested all 4 suspects in a nearby trailer. At first, Erin claimed she'd been kidnapped, but both Wilkinson and Wade told investigators she was the architect of the crime. She was charged as an adult with 3 counts of capital murder, along with her accomplices. Under a plea agreement reached in early 2009, Erin pled guilty and received 2 life sentences plus an additional 25 years. Texas law made her eligible for parole after 40 years in prison, or when she would turn 59 years old. Her father, though gravely wounded, later forgave her. In interviews, he explained how faith and grief intertwined, that his daughter, entrusted to his spiritual care, had plotted this massacre, but he still visited her monthly in prison. After initially supporting the death penalty for Wilkinson and Wade, he withdrew that request, insisting it would not bring back his wife or sons. Today, he ministers full-time, speaking at 600 schools and 800 churches across the United States with a message of forgiveness sparked by his own tragedy. Psychologists and criminal observers suggest Erin's motivations sprang from teenage insecurity, codependency, and emotional manipulation. She reportedly believed murder would free her to stay with Charlie, and had even tried to enlist another ex-boyfriend to commit violence before Wilkinson entered the picture. That, experts say, reflects a toxic mix of adolescent delusion, emotional immaturity, and the influence of an older peer. Now in her early 30s and serving time in a Texas prison, Erin's story continues to stun. A child of church, homeschooled until 6 weeks before the crime, she became the mastermind of a familicide so shocking it defied her prior facade. What lingers is this: how could a teenager so bound by faith and routine betray everything she once represented? And what does her case say about love control and where justice stops and forgiveness must begin? Number 10, Alyssa Bustamante. Alyssa Daleen Bustamante was 15 years old on the evening of October 21st, 2009, living in the rural town of St. Martins, Missouri. At the time, she was a high school sophomore with no criminal record and little outward turmoil. Her grandparents, who had adopted her and her younger siblings after her mother abandoned them due to addiction and her father was imprisoned for assault, raised her in a strict household under the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Teachers and classmates described her as quiet, polite, and enrolled in math and writing courses, but nothing hinted at the darkness she would unleash. Yet beneath that calm surface, Alyssa carried intense emotional pain and confusion. She had battled severe depression and had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt in her early teens. In journals uncovered later, she wrote about self-harm and homicidal fantasies. More chilling still was her fascination with violence. She wrote of wanting to know what it felt like to take a life. Friends and neighbors noted increasingly disturbing social media posts. At that time, she listed cutting and killing people among her hobbies, alongside selfies with fake blood and ominous poses. In the late afternoon of October 21st, she convinced her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olton, to meet her in the woods behind their homes. Using her younger sister as an unwitting lure, she isolated the girl before strangling her, slitting her throat, and stabbing her. Alyssa had dug a shallow grave days in advance and buried Elizabeth under leaves and twigs. In her diary that night, she admitted, "It was amazing. As soon as you get over the 'oh my God, I can't do this' feeling, it's pretty enjoyable." She then went to a church dance as if nothing had happened. By 2 days later, after Elizabeth's disappearance roused hundreds of volunteers into area woods, investigators recovered Alyssa's diary and inconsistencies in her account. She eventually led officers to the grave, and a shallow hole a short distance away contained a decoy blanket. Investigators emphasized that both graves displayed eerie premeditation. Alyssa was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action, but accepted a plea in January 2012 to second-degree murder plus the separate weapons charge. During her February sentencing, she tearfully said to Elizabeth's family, "If I could give my life to bring her back, I would. I'm sorry." The judge imposed life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive 30-year term, making parole eligibility only possible after serving at least 35 years under Missouri law. Mental health professionals who reviewed her case found she suffered from major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. Experts called her an example of adolescent brain development altered by trauma impulsivity and dark fixation. Prosecutors countered that her actions were not impulsive, but meticulously planned to Graves' use of a lure and disposal of the weapon. Her defense, however, pointed to her fragile psyche as evidence of desperate disconnection rather than evil intent. Though she was eligible for an early parole hearing, under changes to juvenile sentencing laws in 2024, the legislature amended state law before the hearing to block all second-degree murder convictions from early parole eligibility. Alyssa was ultimately denied parole, and under current policy, her earliest possible release, a hypothetical based on serving the full combined sentences, will fall sometime around 2059, when she would be in her mid-60s. In the end, Alyssa Bustamante remains a case study in extreme adolescent pathology, a seemingly ordinary girl whose private mind harbored violent curiosity so intense she acted on it. She once wrote she wanted to see what murder felt like. Now, the question lingers if a teenager can view homicide as cause and effect is amazing. What does that say about how trauma, adolescent brain development, and morality intersect, and how society should weigh punishment against psychological fracture? Number 11, Shelia Eddy. Shelia Ray Eddy was 16 years old in the early hours of July 6, 2012, when friends and classmates would falsely be the last to see her best friend, Skylar Neese. At that time, Eddy attended University High School near Morgantown, West Virginia, the same school as the honors student Skylar. The two had grown up together in small-town West Virginia, introduced through church youth groups when Eddy was just 8, and Skylar later called her like one of the family. Eddy was well-liked, kept a low profile, and seemed without trouble until hidden resentments began to show. By the summer of 2012, tensions had built between Eddy Rachel Shoaff and Skylar. Eddy and Shoaff had entered a romantic relationship and were unable to control the narrative among their peer group. Whispers of exclusivity and social shifting caused friction. Skylar had no role in the drama, but Eddy and Shoaff's growing disdain for her, reportedly because they didn't like her anymore, would soon produce lethal consequences. Shortly after midnight on July 6th, Skylar quietly slipped through her bedroom window. She walked down the street to Eddy's car, expecting a routine outing. Eddy and Shoaff drove past the school, through the state line into neighboring Pennsylvania to woods they had visited to hide when they smoked marijuana. On arrival, the girls said they'd forgotten a lighter. Skylar turned to return to the car, and Eddy and Shoaff, standing behind her, counted 1, 2, 3. That was the moment she was stabbed, reportedly, more than 50 times. She fell, tried to crawl, even managed to grab one of the knives to defend herself before being overpowered. They hit her body using branches, rocks, and leaves. Then they changed clothes, wiped down the car, and returned home quietly. For months, both girls acted like grieving friends. Eddy even joined Skylar's parents in placing missing person flyers and reading statements urging anyone with information to speak up. But nothing matched their facade. In January 2013, Rachel Shoaff collapsed under psychological pressure at home. She eventually sickened of the lies and confessed to detectives that she and Eddy had plotted Skylar's murder. Within days, she led them to a brush-covered shallow grave in Greene County, Pennsylvania. Shoaff pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in May 2013 and received a 30-year prison sentence with parole eligibility after 10 years. Eddy identified publicly by prosecutors that September pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in January 2014 to avoid a Pennsylvania indictment because she was under 18 at the time Eddy was sentenced under West Virginia law to life in prison, with mercy making her eligible for parole after 15 years. She remains incarcerated at Lakin Correctional Center near the Ohio River. The Neese family responded to Eddy's plea with little remorse from her. So Skylar's father called her a cold-blooded killer, vowing to see that she never experienced freedom in the way his daughter never would. The local community was shaken not only by the brutality, but by the betrayal and the idea that a teenager could carry out premeditated violence. Psychological analysts pinpointed adolescent impulsivity, peer influence, and emotional isolation as underlying causes. Court interviews suggest Eddy believed the killing would permanently sever ties between her and Skylar, preserving her relationship with Shoaff. Experts note such teenage schemes can grow from jealousy exclusion and distorted loyalty, especially when no adult intervenes. Now in her mid-20s, nearing age 27, Eddy remains behind bars. Her first opportunity for parole will arise in mid-2028. But the Neese family has vowed to oppose any attempt at release, believing justice must endure. If a girl so outwardly ordinary could orchestrate the murder of her closest friend simply because she had fallen out of favor, what does that say about power influence and teenage disconnection? In the silence of the woods, she once sneaked off into Skylar's voice, still asked the question, why,